The cockpit took the first burst high on the fuselage, a hard metallic slap that threw the whole aircraft sideways, and Master Chief Dale Ostrander was screaming into the cabin before the smoke had even cleared the flight deck. "Can anyone fly this? Somebody get up here. Both pilots are down. Can anyone fly this airplane?" I was strapped into the jump seat behind the cargo netting with 11 other men, and I felt the transport roll hard right, engines whining wrong, the horizon outside my window tilting until I couldn't tell up from down anymore. Ostrander had his hand pressed against the pilot's shoulder, checking for a pulse he wasn't going to find easy in that shaking airframe, and the co-pilot beside him was slumped against the yoke, unconscious, blood running dark along his collar. Nobody moved. 12 operators, the best I'd ever served alongside, and every single one of us sat frozen in our harnesses because none of us had ever been trained to fly a crippled transport aircraft losing altitude over hostile terrain. I remember thinking, absurdly, that this was the one scenario nobody had briefed us on. Then Specialist Naomi Vale unclipped her harness and moved forward. I'd known Vale for 4 months by then, mostly by reputation as the quiet loadmaster who kept the manifest tight and never said much in the briefing room. She wasn't rated air crew beyond her load certification. She wasn't anybody's idea of a pilot. I remembered a mission planning session 3 weeks earlier where a young lieutenant had asked her to double-check the weight distribution on a resupply run, and she'd corrected his math without looking up from her clipboard, quiet, matter of fact, the kind of competence that men in that unit had learned to expect from her without ever asking where it came from. Nobody had asked. That was the whole shape of the problem. When she pushed past Ostrander into the cockpit, he actually put a hand out to stop her, some reflex of protecting a non-flying crew member from a controls panel she had no business touching. "Vale, get back, this isn't." "Move your hand off the yoke, Master Chief," she said, already dragging the co-pilot's slumped weight sideways out of the seat. "I need that seat and I need it now." He moved his hand. I think it was less her words than her voice, flat and certain in a way that cut through the alarm chimes and the engine noise and his own panic, that made him step back rather than argue. She dropped into the co-pilot's seat, scanned the instrument panel for a fraction of a second that felt like an hour, and started calling out numbers to nobody in particular, the way a pilot talks to an aircraft when there's no time to explain herself to the men behind her. "Left engine's feathered, that's why we're pulling right. Hydraulic pressures dropping on the primary system, switching to backup. Ostrander, get on that radio. I need you calling our position and altitude to anyone who will listen." "You're a loadmaster," Ostrander said, still not quite believing his own hands had let go of the controls. "I'm rated multi-engine transport with 1,100 hours, 6 of them in this exact airframe," she said, hands already moving across switches like she'd flown this particular tail number 100 times, which I would learn later she nearly had. "I flew cargo runs for 3 years before this unit pulled my file and decided a woman with a pilot's license made a better loadmaster than a better pilot. Nobody asked. I didn't argue. Get on the radio." He got on the radio. I watched through the open cockpit door as the aircraft's wild roll gentled, not smooth, not calm exactly, but controlled, deliberate, a woman fighting a damaged airframe back toward something like level flight with a competence none of us had known to look for in her. The whine of the dying left engine kept climbing, and she reached up and cut it entirely rather than let it keep fighting her on the right engine's power, a decision I later learned some rated pilots freeze on making even in a simulator. Behind me, one of the younger operators, a private named Koss who couldn't have been more than 20, gripped the netting so hard his knuckles went white and asked nobody in particular whether the loadmaster actually knew how to fly a plane like this or was just doing something to keep her hands busy. I didn't have an answer for him. None of us did yet. All we had was the fact that the wild, sickening roll that had thrown 2 men out of their harnesses 10 minutes earlier had eased into something we could sit inside without our stomachs trying to climb out through our throats, and that had to count for something. "Feathered and secured," she said out loud to herself as much as anyone. "Single engine, that's fine, that's flyable. I need altitude and I need a heading." Ostrander read her the coordinates the ground controller was screaming back at him. Some strip of hard-packed desert 40 kilometers out that had never been rated for anything bigger than a light utility aircraft. And Vale didn't hesitate. She banked us toward it, gentle, testing how much the damaged airframe would give her before committing to anything sharper. "That's not a real runway," said Corporal Ray's Damon, one of the operators near the cockpit door, voice tight. "That's a training strip. We're never landing a transport on that." "We're not landing a transport on that," Vale said. "We're landing this transport on that because it's 400 meters longer than the manual says I need on a good day, and today isn't a good day, but it's the day we've got." Nobody laughed. Nobody had it in them. But something in the flatness of her delivery, the total absence of panic in a voice giving us the worst news of the flight, settled the cabin in a way Ostrander's shouting never could have. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. Vale worked that single engine and a set of half-functioning hydraulics like she was coaxing a wounded animal down out of a tree, small corrections, patient, never fighting the aircraft harder than it could take. Twice the airframe shuddered hard enough that gear rattled loose from the overhead netting, and both times she rode it out without so much as raising her voice on the intercom. She'd rigged from the cockpit speaker, so the whole cabin could hear her calling airspeed and altitude like a woman reading off a grocery list. At one point, the co-pilot beside her, still unconscious, slid against his harness and knocked a fistful of loose charts off the console onto the floor. And she didn't even glance down at them, didn't break her scan of the instruments for a fraction of a second, just kept flying with the same unhurried economy of motion she'd shown from the first moment she'd taken the seat. Ostrander crouched beside the co-pilot, checking his pulse again, calling out that it was faint but steady, and Vale absorbed the information the way she absorbed everything else that morning, filing it, adjusting nothing about her hands on the controls, because there was nothing she could do about the co-pilot's condition that would matter if she lost the aircraft first. Word came out much later, pieced together from her old squadron records, that this wasn't the first crippled airframe she'd brought down. 3 years flying resupply routes nobody else wanted had handed her nearly every failure mode this kind of aircraft could throw at a crew, engine fires, hydraulic bleedouts, a gear malfunction over open water that never made it into any official report. She'd simply never had cause to mention any of it to men who only ever saw her checking manifests. "Gear's not going to come down clean," she said at the 12-minute mark. "Hydraulic pressure's too low. I'm going to try the emergency release, and if that doesn't work, we're bringing her in on the belly. Ostrander, get everyone braced, crash positions now." Ostrander moved through the cabin fast, checking harnesses, and I watched him pause at the cockpit door and look at her for a long moment before going back to his job. Something in his face had already started to change, the shape of a man revising every assumption he'd built about the loadmaster he thought he knew. The emergency release worked on the second try, gear grinding down rough and locking with a shudder that ran through the whole airframe, and Vale let out a breath I heard clean through the intercom. "Gears down. Not confirmed locked, but down. We're going in hot, faster than I'd like, but we're going in on wheels instead of belly. Brace." Ostrander moved through the cabin a second time, faster now, checking every harness with his own hands rather than trusting men to have done it right the first time, and I watched him stop at Cass's seat and grip the young private's shoulder hard enough to steady him. "She's got it," he said, low, more to himself than to Cass. "She's got it, just hold on." I don't think he fully believed his own words yet. I think he needed to say them anyway. Through the cockpit door I could see Vale's hands never stop moving, small adjustments on the yoke, a glance at the strip growing larger in the windscreen, another glance at gauges that meant nothing to me and everything to her. The training strip came up fast, a pale ribbon of packed dirt flanked by scrub, and for one terrible second the whole aircraft seemed to hang in the air like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to fly or fall. The landing itself felt like being inside a drum somebody was beating with a sledgehammer, the aircraft slamming down hard, bouncing once, tires screaming against packed dirt that had never been meant to take this kind of weight at this kind of speed. I braced with the rest of the cabin, teeth rattling, certain for 3 full seconds that we were about to come apart around us. Then the deceleration caught, the nose stayed down, and the whole aircraft shuddered to a stop 40 meters short of where the training strip ended in scrub brush and rock. Silence. Then somebody started laughing, high and shaky, the sound men make when their bodies haven't caught up yet to the fact that they're alive. I unclipped my harness with hands that weren't steady and made my way forward to the cockpit, where Vale was still sitting in the co-pilot's seat, both hands resting flat on her thighs, staring out at the dust settling over the strip like she was memorizing the moment. Ostrander stood in the cockpit doorway, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. Then he came to attention, right there in the cramped space between the seats, and saluted her, slow and deliberate, the kind of salute I'd only ever seen given to officers twice his rank. "Master Chief, I'm a specialist," Vale said quietly. "You don't have to do that." "I know what rank you are," Ostrander said. "I'm not saluting your rank." She stood, legs unsteady after the strain of the flight, and returned the salute anyway, clean and unhurried, because that was simply how she did things. Behind Ostrander, the rest of the cabin had crowded toward the cockpit door, and one by one, without anybody giving an order, every man on that aircraft came to some version of attention in the cramped aisle, boots planted, back straight, watching a loadmaster they'd spent 4 months underestimating stand up out of a co-pilot's seat she had no business occupying and had just saved every one of their lives from that seat regardless. Command flew a recovery team out within the hour, and by the time they landed, word of what had happened on that strip had already outpaced the official report. The flight surgeon who checked the unconscious co-pilot on the tarmac told us both pilots would live, the captain with a fractured collarbone from the initial impact, the co-pilot with a concussion that would keep him grounded for a month, but nothing worse. Every one of us walked off that aircraft on our own legs, which felt, in the hour after, like the least likely outcome the morning could have produced. I heard later that Vale's flight instructor rating got quietly reinstated within the week, that the unit which had pulled her file to make her a loadmaster instead of a pilot got a very pointed inquiry from somewhere well above their pay grade, and that Ostrander personally walked her paperwork through 3 different offices himself rather than let it sit on somebody's desk. He told me once, months afterward, that he'd spent every day since that flight replaying the moment he'd put his hand out to stop her from taking the co-pilot's seat, and that he intended to spend a long time making up for it. I've flown on a dozen aircraft since that day, always a little more aware than I used to be of who's sitting quietly in the back doing a job beneath what they're capable of. Vale never talked about that flight afterward, not once that I heard, not even when men who'd been on that aircraft tried to buy her a drink to hear the story again. She just went back to checking manifests and running load calculations like nothing extraordinary had happened, and maybe for her, given everything I eventually learned about the hours she'd logged before the Army ever met her, it hadn't. Koss, the young private who'd asked me if she even knew how to fly, ended up requesting transfer to her section 3 months later, and the last I heard he was logging his own flight hours under her instruction, learning from the woman he'd once doubted midair without ever meaning her any real harm, just carrying the same blind assumption the rest of us had carried. But for the men who'd frozen in our harnesses while she calmly took a dying aircraft and a screaming Master Chief and brought us down alive on a strip that was never built for us, nothing about how we looked at her ever went back to what it had been before.